Alright, everybody, and we are back today talking about none other than the Indianapolis Colts staying right in the AFC South after talking about the Houston Texans. And just looking forward, our next video will also be about the AFC South with the Jacksonville Jaguars, but that'll be for tomorrow. So, as of right now, looking at Indianapolis, this is a team that, really looking back over the last 20 or so years, you could say they've had sustained success for the most part. Of course, Peyton Manning entering the picture in 1998, which really turned their fortunes around. But after he departs following the 2011 season, they do have some initial success here with Andrew Luck, although over the last 8 seasons, they have only made the playoffs 2 of those last 8. However, I do think it's important to note, of those 8 seasons, they only had 3 of those with losing records. So the Colts have been mediocre, I guess you could say, pretty average team, but they haven't been bad, although last year was certainly an exception to that, where they go 4-12-1. And of course, after Andrew Luck departs with an abrupt retirement before the 2019 season, they roll with a different quarterback every single one of these seasons. Jacoby Brissett in 2019. Phillip Rivers is able to get them to the playoffs in 2020 to Super Wildcard Weekend against the Buffalo Bills. Then in 2021 with Carson Wentz, of course, they lose the final game of the season to the last place Jacksonville Jaguars, end up missing the playoffs that season as well. And then just last year, as we'll see in a second, they bring in Matt Ryan for his swan song, which that would be a good opportunity as any to go forward to the 2022 Indianapolis Colts. So, like we mentioned, they finished with a 4-12-1 record. Frank Reich was their head coach for the first 9 weeks of the season, as he was dating back to 2018. But after posting a 3-5-1 record, Frank Reich gets shown the door. The Colts decide to move in a different direction, and they bring in Jeff Saturday as the interim head coach, a move that surprised very many people, myself included. Jeff Saturday was, of course, the Colts' all-pro center back in the 2000s when Peyton Manning was at the helm, but certainly didn't have a lot of coaching experience, certainly not at the NFL level. So definitely a puzzling hire for sure as an interim head coach, but perhaps like with the Houston Texans, this was another AFC South team that wanted to get a high draft pick, but we'll get to that in a minute here. Briefly, we'll go over this 2022 Colts roster. Really not too much to say. Very poor offensive showing, ranked 30th in the league in terms of points for, 27th in terms of yards, and their defense really not much better. 28th in terms of points allowed, but 15th in terms of yards allowed, so a little bit better, but that could also be attributed to the fact that the offense was throwing more interceptions than any team in the NFL, so the defense was not really given many opportunities for success. So, looking at the actual schedule last year, Colts go 4-12-1, as we mentioned a couple times already, but do think it's interesting to note that they go 1-4-1 in the AFC South. So, like we mentioned with the Houston Texans, another team that had, I believe they were 3-13-1, so they were worse than the Indianapolis Colts, but the Texans actually had a 3-2-1 divisional record last season. The Colts and Texans tie here in week 1, but the Colts only go 1-4-1 in the AFC South. Certainly not going to win your divisional title with that record, and likely not going to make the playoffs either, despite how well you could do in some of these other games, which in the Colts case they really didn't. It's funny though, because they do have a couple pretty big upsets. They're able to defeat the Kansas City Chiefs in week 3, which one of very few teams that was able to defeat the Kansas City Chiefs last season. Funny enough, it was the Indianapolis Colts, right? A team that only won 12 games, but I'm sorry, only won 4 games. They lost 12. And then they also beat the Jacksonville Jaguars as their lone divisional win, even though Jacksonville was the team that would go on to actually win the division. So you would think that one win would have been against Houston, maybe even Tennessee, but no, it was against the Jaguars because the Colts are just weird like that, at least the 2022 Colts. So looking forward to some of these individual statistics, as we mentioned, Matt Ryan was the quarterback. He starts 12 games, and frankly, he was one of the worst performing quarterbacks in the NFL last year. Just over 3,000 yards, 14 touchdowns, 13 interceptions. So he's throwing more than one interception a game. That's never a recipe to win football games. They also have Sam Ellinger in there for 3 starts, 3 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, 573 yards. Really nothing exceptional, but not horrible either. Pretty much what you'd expect from a young backup. And then Nicky Franchise himself coming in for 2 starts, but even this was too tall a task for the mighty Nick Foles. 0 touchdowns and 4 interceptions in 2 starts. So, as we'll see in a second, it would seem that Matt Ryan and Nick Foles have both decided to call it a career, as neither player are on an NFL roster heading into the 2023 season, but both certainly left their mark on the NFL, and would like to take a moment to congratulate them for all that they've achieved at the NFL level. Moving on to rushing and receiving stats here, really not too much to note here either. Jonathan Taylor is definitely their best player. Skill position wise, he only plays 11 games though to an injury shortened season. He finishes with 861 yards on the ground and 4 touchdowns, so still absolutely producing in a shortened season. And then in terms of receiving, Michael Pittman Jr. is certainly their number 1 target, but not really much doing behind him here. Paris Campbell, Alex Pierce putting up an okay showing, then really not much else after that. Then finally, we will look at, we can look at the defense briefly. There's not really much to see here, though. Yannick Ngakoue had a solid season, but as we'll see in a second, he's actually no longer with the Indianapolis Colts. And DeForest Buckner, 8 sacks last season, 2 forced fumbles, 22 quarterback hits, 3 pass deflections, so certainly one of their best defenders, one of their core pieces on defense for sure. He was a top 10 pick of the 49ers, if you recall, back in 2016 before being traded to the Indianapolis Colts prior to the 2020 draft for the first round pick that would become Javon Kinlaw. So the 49ers get another solid defensive lineman out of that trade. I think both teams would ultimately be happy with that swap, though. Then in terms of interceptions, Rodney Thomas the 4th with 4 picks, then Stephon Gilmore and Rodney McLeod with another 2 each, but as we'll see here, neither of these players are with the Indianapolis Colts for 2023. So on that note, before we turn the page to the Colts offseason, we'll give a shout out to Quentin Nelson, their only Pro Bowl player from 2022. He is, of course, their starting left guard, drafted in the top 10 of 2018 after, this was as a result of the trade between the New York Jets and the Indianapolis Colts, where the Jets move up to select Sam Darnold and the Colts move back to take Quentin Nelson. Certainly a decisive win there for the Indianapolis Colts. Don't really like to give out front office wins for trades because different teams need different things, but I think Quentin Nelson plus more draft picks in exchange for Sam Darnold, the Colts came out on top with that one. So now looking at the Colts offseason, what did they do to try to turn their fortunes around? Well, I think we should start by mentioning they bring in yet another Eagles offensive coordinator that took them to the Super Bowl as their head coach. This time, instead of Frank Reich, they go with Shane Steichen as their guy on the sidelines. And looking at some of their notable departures, just to see what Indianapolis is going to have to try to replace for 2023. Of course, Matt Ryan, no longer with the Indianapolis Colts. He is currently unemployed. I would like to imagine at this point he's probably called it a career. I'd be very surprised if he finds himself on another NFL roster, but certainly a decorated career Matt Ryan has had with that MVP season, of course, in 2016, taking the Falcons all the way to Super Bowl 51. And I'm pretty sure he is actually working back in the Atlanta Falcons organization. At least he's been making appearances at training camp. I know that much for certain. Some of the other notable losses, as we talked about in the Atlanta video, Yannick Ngakoue has departed for the Atlanta Falcons, and he was, I don't even see him here, but he was a player who, here he is. Oh, he goes to the Bears, my mistake. In the Bears video, I don't know why I have it written down that he went to Atlanta. We even discussed this, but he departs to the Chicago Bears, played 64% of snaps last year, and he will certainly be somebody to help them turn their fortunes around. And as we mentioned with the Dallas Cowboys, Stephon Gilmore, he gets traded to the Dallas Cowboys. He figures to be their number 2 cornerback this season. And then we also have Matt Pryor, who was their left tackle last season, played 50% of offensive snaps. He moves on to the San Francisco 49ers, where he will likely back up Trent Williams at the tackle position, but we'll address that when we get to San Francisco's video. Some of the other players they lost, Indianapolis does actually have quite a few notable players they lost here, but as we mentioned with the Cleveland Browns, Rodney McLeod moves on to join the Browns as a backup safety. Additionally, we have a pair of players going to the New York Giants. Wide receiver Paris Campbell, the Indianapolis Colts #2 receiver last year, in addition to Bobby Okereke, linebacker, who will also be joining him with the New York Giants. He played 85% of snaps for the Indianapolis Colts. Then finally for the departures, I will give a shout out to Chase McLaughlin. That's certainly notable whenever a team moves on from their kicker. Certainly one like the Indianapolis Colts, they play in a dome, so if they have a good kicking game, there really shouldn't be too much interrupting him from putting points on the board. And on that note, we will look at the acquisitions and we'll keep it right with the kicking position. They bring in Matt Gay from the Los Angeles Rams, another player who played in a dome the year before, so he's certainly used to not having to deal with the elements. Then we look at some other players they bring in. They bring in from the San Francisco 49ers. Where is he? Right at the top here, Samson Ebukam. And I did look up how to pronounce that one. So he joins the Indianapolis Colts on the edge, and we also have Al-Qadim Muhammad from the Chicago Bears. So they effectively swap with Yannick Ngakoue. Think that'll be a pretty fair trade for both sides, maybe benefiting the Bears a little bit, but the Bears are paying Yannick Ngakoue north of $10 million, whereas the Colts are just paying Al-Qadim Muhammad a little over $1 million. So Colts certainly saving some money there. Then finally, I will mention from the Buffalo Bills, wide receiver Isaiah McKenzie. So he certainly figures to be a replacement for Paris Campbell, who departed to the New York Giants. So certainly looking forward to see what Isaiah McKenzie can do in this Colts offense now that he's no longer with Josh Allen. And on that note, we will look at the Colts 2023 NFL Draft. And certainly they still needed to replace their quarterback position with Matt Ryan no longer in the fold. And with the number 4th overall selection, they do just that. They take Anthony Richardson out of the University of Florida. Very young man. I believe he's only the age of 21 still. A very raw product. Certainly a physical specimen, but he's somebody that's seen as potentially needing a little bit of time to develop to the NFL game. He's going to need a little bit of time to really start to learn how NFL defenses operate, learn Shane Steichen's offense, and he's certainly a quarterback where if he does have a rough rookie campaign this year, I'm not going to hold it against him. He does have a ton of time, and it seems that the Colts are finally taking the more patient approach with the quarterback position as opposed to just throwing another retread in there and trying to go for a cheap playoff berth. Because, I mean, as good as the Indianapolis Colts rosters have been over the last few seasons, I think even Colts management was honest enough to understand that even with a veteran quarterback in there, like a Phillip Rivers, a Carson Wentz, a Matt Ryan, Jacoby Brissett, whoever they put in there, their peak was pretty much where they were at with, if we could go back real quick, with Andrew Luck in 2018 where they get to the divisional round. I don't think even with any of those quarterbacks playing to their peak at their age, they would have made it further than that. So good to see the Colts finally embracing the fact that they need their new franchise guy, somebody that can be developed through their system, can come up in their offense and really build some camaraderie and some chemistry with the players and the coaching staff and even with the fans, honestly. I know that really shouldn't even matter too much, but give the fans some attachment. It'll give them somebody that they can go out and buy Anthony Richardson's jersey and feel like, yeah, that's their quarterback now. That's somebody they can identify with the Indianapolis Colts. They have a direction now, which I certainly don't believe should be underestimated at all. So that being said, looking at some of these other players that the Colts drafted, some of the more notable ones include defensive back Julius Brents, or Juju Brents, if you will. In the 3rd round, they select Josh Downs, another wide receiver, to give some competition to Isaiah McKenzie, as we'll see in a second. Then they also select Darius Rush in the 5th round. He could be in line for some playing time this season. And then they do have some just depth pieces here. They add some depth in the 4th round to the trenches on both sides of the football. And then they have a bunch of late round picks here where really just some late round flyers looking to take a shot in the dark, Hope some of these guys can really develop into something useful for the Indianapolis Colts going forward. And on that note, we'll see where these guys shake out on the depth chart. So taking a look at this 2023 Colts roster, certainly much different from last season. There are some familiar faces for sure, but we'll start out with the quarterback position. So there was some debate for a while early on in the preseason. Can Gardner Minshew compete with Anthony Richardson for this starting job? Gardner Minshew was formerly the quarterback for the Jacksonville Jaguars originally before Trevor Lawrence, and last season he was the backup to Jalen Hurts in Philadelphia. And many people will probably remember he stepped in for that Christmas Eve game against the Dallas Cowboys and nearly defeated Dallas in Jerry World, although he did lose to the New Orleans Saints the following week on New Year's Day. But Gardner Minshew certainly proved that he can still play effectively at the NFL level. He's familiar with Shane Steichen's offense. Anthony Richardson's a raw product. Certainly seems like a recipe where Minshew could potentially step in as the starter, at least right away. Maybe Richardson could end up finishing the season or just hold him until 2024, but this week the Colts did come out and make an official announcement that Anthony Richardson will indeed be the Week 1 starter, and Gardner Minshew is fully supportive of that. So seems like their quarterback room is firmly in line here with Richardson as the 1, Minshew as the 2, then Sam Ehlinger hanging around from last season as the number 3. So certainly look forward to seeing Anthony Richardson in this offense. And another player I'm really looking forward to seeing him play with is, we'll go right to the running back position with Jonathan Taylor. I know there has been a ton of drama with Jonathan Taylor's situation, really with the running back position as a whole around the NFL. Although recently it does seem like things are starting to find somewhat of a resolution. Ezekiel Elliott just signed with the Patriots yesterday, and Dalvin Cook also signed with the New York Jets the very same day. So AFC East loading up on running backs, but those guys both making south of $10 million for one season. So Jonathan Taylor's still looking to get paid. He certainly had a lot of drama with the owner Jim Irsay at training camp, saying he wants to trade now. He is in a contract season. Then he's also saying now that he's injured as well, so they have him on the PUP list. But I think when all's said and done, Jonathan Taylor will be on the field for the Indianapolis Colts Week 1. Does he end up finishing the season with the Colts? That's definitely a much larger question, and certainly a huge question mark of if he'll be with the Colts in 2024. But I think for the time being, though, this could be the perfect player to pair with Anthony Richardson as a rookie. I mean, if we really want to go back, staying with the same franchise, I think back to 1998 when they had a rookie quarterback, Peyton Manning, paired up with star running back Marshall Faulk in what would ultimately be his last season in Indianapolis before he took off with the Rams on the greatest show on turf the following season to win the Super Bowl. So, not saying Jonathan Taylor is going to go to the Rams and win the Super Bowl next season, but certainly think he would be a good player to put behind Anthony Richardson to really take some of the pressure off of him, put the ball in 28's hands, let him keep you in ball games. It'll take some of the workload off of Richardson. Just makes sense to me. But that being said, they do have Zach Moss, who they acquired via trade with Buffalo last year as the number 2 running back. And I really don't think there should be too much of a debate there. He should slot in right behind Jonathan Taylor. He's certainly not taking over the number 1 role unless Jonathan Taylor is not on the field. And I don't really see any of these other players taking over that number 2 position. Although I do think it is interesting to note Evan Hull and Deion Jackson are competing for this number 3 position. And word is out of camp that the rookie, Evan Hull, he really has impressed the coaching staff quite a bit. So would not be surprised if he ends up with this number 3 running back spot. And if Jonathan Taylor doesn't have a future with the Colts, if he's not on the field Week 1, if he doesn't finish the season with the Colts, Evan Hull could be somebody who steps in and really produces for the Indianapolis Colts just off of sheer reps alone. So that being said, we'll move on to the tight end position because there is a position battle going on here as well. There's a lot, just letting you know right now, there are going to be quite a few position battles with this Indianapolis Colts roster, but certainly to be expected with a new head coach, a new quarterback in there, and all the turnover that we just saw on the roster. So at this tight end position, we have a competition right now between second-year man Jelani Woods and the veteran Mo Alley Cox. I do think it is interesting to note here that both of these gentlemen missed the first preseason game due to injury. Although if I did have to make a knee-jerk reaction as to who wins this competition right now, it's probably Jelani Woods, although would not be surprised if both of these players have a role in the offense for 2023. Looking now at the wide receiver position, so Michael Pittman Jr. certainly figures to be the number one option at wide receiver for the Indianapolis Colts, and then Alec Pierce, the second-year player, should slot in as the number two, with a competition going on, as I hinted to earlier, between Isaiah McKenzie and Josh Downs, the rookie. And word is out of camp that the coaching staff has been very impressed with the rookie Josh Downs, but they like Isaiah McKenzie as well, so maybe both of these players do have a bit of a rotation at the slot position. Certainly not the worst thing in the world, especially with a rookie quarterback in place. He might need to utilize these slot receivers a little bit more than the guys on the outside. So definitely excited for the opportunity for Isaiah McKenzie to prove he can win without, well, not win, I'm sure he does want to win, but to be a successful NFL receiver without Josh Allen, and then for Josh Downs to make a name for himself in the NFL with the Indianapolis Colts, his first team in his first season. So now looking at this offensive line, and I will say this is not a bad offensive line by any means. This is probably, if I had to put it on a similar level to some of the offensive lines we've talked about, it's probably around the same range as a team like Denver, or maybe even a little bit behind a team like Green Bay. They certainly have their star here, Quentin Nelson, at the left guard position, which is quite odd. Usually when a team has a star player on the offensive line, it's typically at the tackle or the center position. But Indianapolis is a little bit backwards here. They do have a star left guard with Quentin Nelson, and Ryan Kelly is certainly a staple here at the center position. And they do have two formidable tackles in Bernard Ram. I need to start looking up some more of these names before how to pronounce them before I do these videos. But Bernard Rayman, is his name really Rayman? Am I pronouncing that correctly? As the left tackle, and then Braden Smith as the right tackle, drafted back in 2018. So both of those guys are certainly penciled in as the starting tackles right now. And then there is a competition going on at the right guard position right now between Will Fries and Danny Pinter. So a third-year and a fourth-year player, both late-round draft picks. May the best man win. And whoever does lose out on that competition certainly figures to be an option to fill in if there's an injury. And they do draft Blake Freeland as a potential reserve at tackle as well. So not a bad offensive line by any means for the Indianapolis Colts. Maybe not quite the tank of a unit it was maybe 3-4 years ago, around the time that Andrew Luck left, ironically, even though he was getting beaten up for quite a few seasons during his time in Indianapolis. But I'd say really around 2018, 2019, 2020, this offensive line was certainly one of the best units in the NFL. But as it stands right now, I'd say it's a fringe top 10 unit. Although if some of these younger players like Mr. Rayman over here could step up at left tackle and continue his development, and maybe one of these two right guards take a next step to really assert themselves into the starting role, this offensive line could be elevated even further. So all in all, not a bad offensive unit for a rookie quarterback to walk into. Certainly will help to have Jonathan Taylor, but that's the big question mark looming over this entire team right now. Now, with that being said, let's look at this defense, because this defense is certainly all over the place. Not necessarily as much of an investment in the defense as with the offense this past offseason, but that's to be expected when you use a top 5 pick on a quarterback. Looking at the defense now, I would say their defensive line is probably, this is about an average defensive line in the NFL. They run a 4-3, so certainly more of an emphasis on this defensive line than with the linebacker position. I've certainly noticed that trend as well with every NFL team we've done so far. If a team runs a 4-3 scheme on defense, or something resembling a 4-3 scheme, they'll usually have more salary cap and draft resources allocated to the defensive line, which naturally makes sense, and they kind of let the linebacker position slip under the radar and then invest in the secondary as well. Whereas the teams that have a 3-4 scheme will usually double down on the linebacker position. Think like the Baltimore Ravens, a team like that, and then kind of let the defensive line just exist and sort of just be a distraction for the offensive line so that they could get more creative in the scheme with how they utilize their linebackers. And I think that certainly holds up with this Indianapolis Colts roster. So they have Kwity Paye, their first round pick from 2021, slated to start at one defensive end position here. And then they do have Tyquan Lewis, their second round pick from 2018, behind him there. And on the other opposite edge, we have a bit of a competition going on right now between the free agent acquisition, Samson Ebukam, and he will be competing with Dai Odangbo, and I did look up how to pronounce that one. So he's the third-year player. Those two will be competing, although right now the veteran Samson Ebukam does have the inside track for this job. And looking at the interior of this defensive line, they do have DeForest Buckner, of course, but really not too many standouts besides him here. So certainly if they were able to upgrade this defensive tackle position, of course no disrespect to Grover Stewart, Eric Johnson, or any of these other young men, but certainly believe if they had another solid player to put next to DeForest Buckner here, this would really take this unit to another level. But as it stands right now, this is your run-of-the-mill NFL defensive line. They have the ability to beat you at times, but not really a ton of depth. And besides DeForest Buckner, not really any players that strike a ton of fear into opposing defenses. So now looking at the linebacker position, they do have Shaquille Leonard holding down the middle here, and as a result, EJ Speed will be likely the Sam side linebacker, or strong side linebacker if you will, with Zaire Franklin coming in as the will side or weak side linebacker. And like I mentioned, really not too much of an emphasis on the linebacker position here, and that's to be expected with them running a 4-3, but also because they do have so many other positions here that they need to address. Now, finally looking at the secondary, I honestly expected a little bit more out of this secondary. I'm going to be honest. They did allocate some draft resources to this in the offseason, but as of right now, this is probably one of the weakest secondaries in the entire National Football League. I am not going to lie. It is probably a bottom 5 unit in the National Football League, perhaps even worse than Houston's, who we just went over in the last video. So, looking at some of the names here, we do have Julian Blackmon penciled in here as the starting strong safety, and there are a couple competitions here as well, this position being one of them. So Julian Blackmon was injured back in the spring with I believe it was a hamstring injury. So the catch is here, they do have Nick Cross, the second-year player. Although Nick Cross was a starter last year initially, but Nick Cross got benched during the midst of the 2022 campaign, so there's a bit of a redemption competition, going on here. You have the player recovering from injury and the player who got benched last year, and they both want this starting strong safety position. As of right now, probably give the edge to Julian Blackmon, although Nick Cross is certainly motivated in training camp this season. Then looking at the free safety position, Rodney Thomas II, second-year player, he's definitely penciled in as the starter here. Not really too much competition for this position. Really not too many, they didn't invest heavily in any free agent acquisitions behind him, nor any draft picks, so this is kind of just Rodney Thomas's job to lose. Then looking at the cornerback position, Juju Brents, the second round pick, stepping right onto the field, he might be their number one corner week 1 this season, which really shows how dire of a situation this secondary really is. But who knows, if Juju Brents could be a playmaker for them, he could certainly help turn this secondary around. There really isn't one guy here you can truly depend on right now. Because then looking at the other side, we have another competition going on between Dallas Flowers and another rookie, Darius Rush, who they selected in the 5th round. So Flowers has been performing well at training camp and probably has the inside track for this job, though I do think it is worth noting in their first preseason game against the Buffalo Bills, Darius Rush had a pick 6 of about 50 yards, so if that doesn't help your fortunes as a young corner trying to make your mark on an NFL roster, I really don't know what does. So won't count out Darius Rush here either, so it is entirely possible the Colts are rolling 2 rookie cornerbacks to start this season. Then finally at the nickel, we will mention Kenny Moore II. So definitely a secondary unit that leaves a lot to be desired, although if these young guys could step up and produce as rookies, they could potentially turn this thing around a little bit quicker than anticipated. But all in all, not really overly enthusiastic about this Colts roster. Certainly more enthusiastic about the offense than I am with the defense. Now, with that being said, let's look at this 2023 schedule, because as I said back with my 2023 predictions, and even as I mentioned in the Houston Texans video last week, or yesterday, I guess I should say, the Houston Texans, the Indianapolis Colts, and the Las Vegas Raiders are really the only three teams I don't believe are in the hunt for this AFC playoff picture. And I mean that, and that's not a slight against them. I just think if you look at the other 13 teams, I think you could make a case for each of the other 13 teams to make the postseason this year. I really do believe that. And that's not a bad thing because, as I mentioned with the Texans, they're a team that bottomed out last year and they have their franchise piece on the offensive side of the ball and the defensive side of the ball now with CJ Stroud and Will Anderson. Whereas the Colts, I think, are also in a more patient approach now with Anthony Richardson. They have their first year head coach in Shane Steichen. Certainly Jim Irsay is one of those owners that wants to see results, but it seems like they're starting to accept the fact that, okay, it might not be our time right now. We could take these next couple of years, let Anthony Richardson develop under Shane Steichen in that offense, and really just start building the team around them now. It seems like they're just beginning that process. They do have pieces in place with Quentin Nelson and Ryan Kelly on the offensive line, Michael Pittman at wide receiver, DeForest Buckner on that defensive line, but really not too many other standout players on this roster, if I'm being honest. And I really was surprised by that. I was expecting the Colts roster to be a little bit more well-rounded than the Houston Texans, but honestly, now that I just looked at both of these rosters back to back, Houston could very well be the better team next year. And of course, the elephant in the room still hanging over with Jonathan Taylor. That's never good for a young locker room and a young quarterback who you want to see develop with a new coach trying to establish his culture. So be interested to see how that situation gets resolved. Do the Colts cave in and give him the money? Do they just trade him and try to use those assets to expedite this rebuild? Anything's on the table. So let's get into the schedule. They start off with back-to-back divisional games, and they start off at home against the Jacksonville Jaguars, and I don't think this is too controversial. I'll give this one to the Jacksonville Jaguars. Then week 2 against the Houston Texans, and I have the Colts winning this game, but after looking at the Texans and the Colts, I would not be surprised at all, honestly, if the Houston Texans did win this matchup. I'll still keep the predictions true for now, just so we can go through these matchups, but we'll tinker around with this a little more when we get to the end of the schedule. In week 3, they go up against the Baltimore Ravens. Ravens are the better team. Week 4 against the Rams. Haven't done a deep dive on the Rams yet, but just knowing what we know about the Rams with Sean McVay, Matthew Stafford, Cooper Kupp, Aaron Donald, they should be able to beat the Indianapolis Colts, so I'll give the Rams this one. Week 5 against the Tennessee Titans, another divisional game. Titans are just the better team, and you could really say that for these next 3 matchups. Titans, Jaguars, Browns, should be 3 losses for the Colts there. Week 8 against the New Orleans Saints, this is certainly one the Colts could win. We haven't done a video on the Saints yet either, but I do believe the Colts are superior to the New Orleans Saints on both sides of the trenches, honestly. I'm not overly impressed with what the New Orleans Saints have going on with their offensive line or their defensive line, and certainly a team I'm intrigued to do a deep dive on because there has been a ton of clout for them as a potential winner of the NFC South this year, but as of right now, I'm simply not buying it with the New Orleans Saints, and I will give the Indianapolis Colts the benefit of the doubt here at home and give them their second win of the season. Then they go on the road against the Carolina Panthers, battle of 2 rookie quarterbacks, Anthony Richardson and Bryce Young, battle of 2 former Eagles offensive coordinators that played in the Super Bowl with the Eagles, Frank Reich with the Carolina Panthers versus Shane Steichen, Frank Reich's revenge game against his prior team that he had coached after he left the Eagles. So That being said, I do think Frank Reich's going to have a chip on his shoulder for this game. He's going to bring out his best stuff. He's going to make sure Bryce Young is on his A game, and the Carolina Panthers take care of business here. Then the Colts go to Germany to take on Bill Belichick and the Patriots, and as much as the Patriots have their question marks this season, I do think New England is simply the more talented team than the Indianapolis Colts at this point. There really aren't too many teams right now that I look at and I think are more talented than the Indianapolis Colts at this point in time. And certainly if Anthony Richardson has a rough rookie season, I mean, I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to hold this against him. I fully expect this year to just be a learning experience for him. And the Colts, we're not going to discuss their future draft picks in this video because there's actually no movement with their future draft picks. I mean that not a single future draft pick has been sent away by the Indianapolis Colts, nor has any future draft picks been acquired by the Indianapolis Colts. They strictly have their own picks. So would not be surprised if the Colts end up finishing last in this AFC South this year. Like we mentioned with the Houston Texans, the Texans actually don't possess their own first round pick this year, so I believe the Houston Texans are certainly going to be incentivized to play better this season. Like, not that the players are going out there with the thought of, oh, well, if we lose this game, we'll be 2 spots higher in the draft. But I think just from a team building perspective, you can tell looking at these rosters, the Houston Texans are definitely built more in mind with winning games in 2023. Not that the Houston Texans have playoff aspirations, but I would not be surprised if the Houston Texans could win 5, 6, potentially even 7 games this season. But looking at this Colts schedule now more in depth, and certainly a lot of these games down the stretch here are brutal as well coming out of the bye week. Tampa Bay, Tennessee, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, these are all tough matchups that I have a really tough time seeing the Colts winning. So I'm not going to say 3 wins is generous for the Colts, but wouldn't be surprised if this could go potentially even lower to 2 wins, or I don't think they'll have just 1 win. I think they will get a couple here, but looking at the end of the schedule, they do have a matchup against Atlanta. They could win this one. Same thing with the Raiders, and then they finish out against the Raiders and the Texans at home. So both of these games could very well be wins as well. But as it stands, I have the Colts with a 3-14 record, and even hypothetically, we give them a win over the Raiders, and say you want to have them sweeping the Texans, which I really don't see happening. I think if anything, the Texans will end up sweeping the Colts. And then, I mean, is there even another game in here that we could give the Colts that we could really say the Colts should decisively win? I mean, maybe the Rams or the Patriots, we could give them one of those. So what, best case scenario, we're talking about the Indianapolis Colts as a 6-11 team. So definitely not having a ton of confidence in this Indianapolis Colts squad this year. But it's not the worst thing in the world. This is a rebuilding team right now, I would say. This is a team that wants Anthony Richardson to learn on the job. They really want to see him figure out this offense by the end of the season. They want to see him build some chemistry with players like Michael Pittman, Quentin Nelson, guys they know will be here long term. And then they can use those draft picks they have, which I imagine will be high draft picks because I don't see this squad competing in the AFC this year. They could use those high draft picks to improve that defense, maybe get some more names in that secondary, and we can really start to see them build this thing up in 2024. But as of right now, I think they end up finishing last in this AFC South. I really do, unfortunately for them, but this is a learning experience for them. And let's just take a peek at their salary cap situation now before we end this video. So they will certainly have some cap space coming up here, have flexibility. It's always the case when you have a rookie quarterback under contract. Anthony Richardson locked up for the next 4 years, plus a potential 5th option. Gardner Minshew just on a 1-year flyer. Jonathan Taylor, of course, in the contract year. Would not be surprised if they decide to trade him either. I mean, it could be before the season, could be at the trade deadline, could even just be next off season. They put the tag on him and then trade him, but would not be surprised if Jonathan Taylor is leaving Indianapolis within the next year at all. Then really not too much else committed to the running back position. Like I said, Evan Hull could end up seizing this job by the end of the season. Then you also have Michael Pittman in a contract year, so he's certainly going to be looking for an extension as well. Then Isaiah McKenzie on a 1-year flyer. Alec Pierce signed at a reasonable cap hit for the next 3 years. Tight end, you have Mo Alley Cox for the next 2, Jelani Woods for the next 3, reasonable cap hits, really not a lot of money spent yet. The money's definitely coming in at the offensive line though, which is money well spent. Ryan Kelly and Quentin Nelson certainly deserve it, and then Braden Smith at right tackle making some money as well. They do have Danny Pinter in a contract year, although Will Fries is signed through next season, so not really too much doing on the cap as of yet. We do have DeForest Buckner with a big cap hit for the next 2 seasons, although be interested to see if he ends up getting an extension there. They could end up hitting him with the franchise tag as well, but they also have Ryan Kelly up after next year. And I feel like there was somebody else we mentioned. Perhaps not, but I mean, if Michael Pittman does get the franchise tag after this year, or Jonathan Taylor, could put them in a sticky situation for 2025, especially if the Colts have a rough 2023 and 2024, which, as we can tell, is entirely possible. Would not be surprised if a player like DeForest Buckner looks at this and says, yeah, you know what, maybe I'll just go get paid by a contender somewhere where I could try to win a Super Bowl. I'm sure he misses that from his days with the San Francisco 49ers. He was a part of that squad that went to Super Bowl 54 against the Kansas City Chiefs. But I'm noticing there really aren't a lot of contracts signed long term. We do have one with Shaquille Leonard at the linebacker position, but pretty much nothing on the secondary. So this is, for the large part, a blank slate beyond this season, I would say. This is really an organization that is embracing the rebuild, it would seem, just by the looks of things. I was really surprised because I was expecting the roles to kind of be reversed between them and the Houston Texans. I thought CJ Stroud was probably going to be in for the more difficult rookie campaign, but looking at this now, I think the Houston Texans certainly have him in a better position for some year one success. Whereas Anthony Richardson, I think the Colts are playing more of a long game with him. They don't necessarily have him set up for, well, they were under the impression Jonathan Taylor was going to be here this season, but if he's not, it could be a very rough campaign for Anthony Richardson. But that honestly seems okay because it seems like the Colts have their sights set on 2024 and potentially even beyond that, just with how much work they have to do with this roster, particularly on the defensive side of the football. So, love to hear from any Colts fans out there, honestly any AFC South fans out there. Am I being too harsh on the Colts? Is this a team that is closer than I think, or are they really just in this thing for the long haul? And what do you think about Anthony Richardson? Is he going to have a better rookie season than Bryce Young or CJ Stroud? We've done videos on all 3 of their teams right now, so after going through all 3, I think Bryce Young probably has the best rookie season, followed by CJ Stroud, then Anthony Richardson, so suppose in the order that they were drafted, but love to hear from anybody's thoughts down below. We will be back in the next video with the Jacksonville Jaguars, so certainly a more exciting team to talk about than the Indianapolis Colts for sure. This is a little bit more of a downer than I thought it would be. Houston was even a little bit more exciting to talk about if I'm being honest, but that's all I really got on the Colts. Look forward to talking to you guys in the next one.